When you look at what happens to the poor, you have to see free trade as part of a pull-up strategy. It's an activist strategy. You're really using good policies to grow faster, create jobs, and pull people up away from poverty. And there's a lot of evidence. India, China. India, since it began these reforms, which included outward orientation and trade, India has managed to pull 200 million people in 15 years out of poverty, above the poverty line. Before they started this and were very autarkic, inward-looking, no impact on poverty at all, which is perfectly commonsensical. As I said, you just can't have a stagnant economy and expect anything to happen for the poor. It's extremely important to remember that trade is not just for GNP growth or national income growth or what we call aggregate welfare without worrying about distribution. It is also terribly important also for lifting people out of poverty. There's two steps in the argument. One is that free trade, as part of a package of policies which rely on markets and avoiding excessive interference with the markets, excessive proliferation of the public sector, which doesn't use profit motive at all in most cases, all of that, the package of liberal reforms which developing countries have had, lifted the rate of growth enormously. And that we know, and that's part of the GNP growth. But the second step of the argument for the poor is that when you have a growing economy, it really pulls people out of poverty by providing more employment. That's the essential way. Secondly, it generates revenues because a stagnant economy doesn't produce revenues. You may have all the great desire to build schools for the poor, provide education, for them, medical care and so on. But if you don't have money to spend on it, it just means you're putting a little, button on the lapel of your jacket saying, I'm going to make poverty history, the way Bono sings, because most of his policy prescriptions are crazy as hell. He should confine himself to singing, and raising money. But essentially, he doesn't understand things like trade. Once we get the money, we then are going to be able to spend it. So a stagnant society is really bad for the poor. Well, free trade is much maligned as setting people behind in terms of incomes, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of social objectives like advancing women's rights and so on. On all three dimensions, actually, free trade is one of the good things. And those of us who have studied it know that it's a very powerful instrument for advancing all these objectives. If you want to persuade people that the trade is good for peace, you don't have to go beyond perfectly commonsensical attitudes. And I think we need to bring that back, or bring back the fact that we advance women's rights through international trade. A whole lot of social agendas get advanced, peace gets advanced. That would enable us to regain the high moral ground, and we don't do enough of that. I wrote a book once called In Defense of Globalization, which is entirely aimed not at saying that trade was good for GNP, because that's something we economists know, but on all of these social agendas, I really went through all the arguments and concluded that far from handicapping social agendas and rights of women and environment and so on and so forth, poverty in the poor countries, child labor, the state of your democratic functioning, on all of them, if you looked at the evidence and the arguments, you could actually conclude that trade was good, not bad, for these things as well. There is an underlying truth, which is that when countries do trade with each other, there's a huge amount of contact. Your mind turns away from things like war to competing with other nations in trade. The interaction phenomenon is also extremely important because when you start trading, you also, when you meet people, you see them, and then all your stereotypes about, what these Muslims are, or what the what the Jewish people are, they begin to dissolve, because there's no better antidote to stereotypes, which feed war frequently, than actually encountering people.